The Ukraine war is moving full steam ahead. Russia has not only targeted weapons provided by the U.S. and its NATO allies, it has hit the capital, Kyiv. And in another major escalation, Putin says that Russia will hit fresh targets if U.S. delivers long-range rockets. In this edition of the Spotlight, we will look at whether the military might of either side will decide when this war will end, while questioning what a win would look like in the first place.
Tensions between Russia and the West over the Ukraine war are entering a new stage as Washington and its allies in Europe continue to send military equipment to Kiev. The U.S.'s new plan to send long-range missiles to Ukraine has sparked a stark warning from Russia.
If they supply Ukraine with long-range missiles, we will draw the appropriate conclusions and use our weapons, of which we have enough, to strike targets we haven't yet hit.
Putin said Moscow is destroying U.S. weapons sent to Ukraine by the dozen. He said Russia is easily coping and targeting the shipments. Putin said the sole aim of the West supplying arms to Ukraine was to prolong the conflict for as long as possible. His warning was echoed by the Russian foreign minister. Sergei Lavrov warned the supply of advanced missile systems to Ukraine raises the risk of a third country getting dragged into the conflict.
The
things that the Kyiv regime unapologetically demands from its Western patrons, firstly overstep all bounds of decency and diplomatic relations, and secondly are a direct provocation aimed at drawing the West into combat.
On Wednesday, U.S. President Joe Biden agreed to provide Ukraine with HIMARS multiple launch rocket systems as part of a $700 million weapons package.
The capabilities in this package include high-mobility artillery rocket systems, or HIMARS, and guided munitions with a range of up to 70 kilometers, 5 counter-artillery radars, 2 air surveillance radars, 1,000 additional Javelins and 50 command launch units, 6,000 anti-armor weapons, 15,000 155mm artillery rounds.
HIMARS is a mobile unit capable of simultaneously launching multiple precision-guided missiles up to 80 kilometers away. Since the start of the conflict in Ukraine, Washington has approved 11 military assistance packages for Ukraine. The biggest was last month and worth $40 billion. European countries have also followed suit. Aside from that, the United States has provided intelligence that helped Ukrainians locate and strike Russian targets. But where does the line between supporting an ally and actively participating in the conflict lie? Many believe that gray zone is getting dangerously blurred. One wrong political move and the fighting in Ukraine could quickly become a war between Russia and NATO.
Let me introduce our guest for this edition of the Spotlight. Debar joins us. He's a journalist and activist from Westchester, New York. Also joining us is Sheehan, who's an anti-war activist who joins us from Sacramento. Welcome to you both. Debar, let me first start with you. We're looking at the most recent development here, and that is how Russia has launched this airstrike into Kyiv for the first time. Now, Russia has said that it has destroyed what it says was Western-supplied tanks and other armored vehicles. And the position that it targeted was actually on the outskirts of Kyiv. And these were supplies that were provided by U.S. and the European countries. Let's first look at that aspect of it, because it's the first time that this has happened, and that's the reason that Russia has given. Russia has stated that it's going to target weapons provided by either the U.S. and or NATO members. But is it also sending a message that it can target Kyiv?
Not only Kyiv, by the way, but Kiev is, we said it for, I don't know, the last 100 years. You know, just to remind people that Russia said that, you know, they could not come forward into Ukraine, that Russia would not allow it. And everyone ignored it, and they had the coup, and they, you know, shelled Donbass for 8 years, and they mobilized to go in and finish off Donbass, and the Russians came in and stopped them. And they've, you know, acquired essentially eastern Ukraine. It's certainly behind the lines now. They can choose to, you know, at will pretty much keep it, Crimea is off the table as far as any realistic person is concerned. And they have the ability to rather easily, if they'd like to, either level Kiev, they could do that pushing 2 or 3 buttons, or to take it, just to starve it and take it. And also Lvov, by the way, or Lviv, depending on your preference. And I think that you have to take seriously what they've done here after saying what they would do, when you consider Finland and Sweden joining NATO, because Finland will be facing a similar situation, finally. Not only can they strike Kiev at will, and people are surprised at that, it may be a fiction that everyone else in the United States buys, and some of the European public, that the United States and NATO are not at war with Russia, but rather Russia and Kiev are duking it out and we're helping an ally. Russian strategic planners and most serious adults on the planet realize, in fact, that's a lot of nonsense. Russia and the United States are at war right now in Ukraine, and at some point in time, if the United States reaches into Russia deeply enough, Russia is going to reach into the United States. First, maybe you'll see Warsaw or perhaps even Berlin get a taste of that kind of a response. But they are perfectly capable of taking out New York City, Los Angeles, Chicago, et cetera, if it gets there. And they have said, look, that's what we'll do if that's where it goes. And yet, the U.S. is going there, it seems.
That's a very fine point that Don Debar is making there, Cindy Sheehan, in terms of the warnings that Russia has given. I mean, from the year, well, I was about to say 2014 when the war started, really, but even prior to that in terms of NATO's eastward expansion. So you can see how long Russia has waited. And now we're looking at the numerous times that Russia is issuing warnings after warning after warning that it's going to target U.S. and NATO's supplies. And here it has done so in Kyiv. The point here is why isn't the U.S. and NATO members taking that warning seriously, and or is that because they want this war to to continue, to prolong, so to speak?
Well, excuse me. I thank you for inviting me again, but I don't think that the United States and its NATO allies and other countries want this war to end. Actually, I think that the profiteering is a huge factor in this. If the United States is the biggest arms manufacturer and weapons dealer in the entire world, so how can the U.S. sell its arms and weapons if there aren't any wars? So I think that Putin and Russia have been very, patient. They were actually very patient for at least these 8 years, like you said, and like Don was saying, how the West and Ukraine has tried to provoke, and NATO has tried to provoke Russia into this situation. And it reminds me of the Cuban Missile Crisis back in 1962 when I was only 5 years old. I know it's hard to imagine that I was ever that young, but I remember how it was the major topic and how all the adults around me were so nervous and worried and upset. And here in the United States, it just seems to be like, the people here in the US are blithely or blandly or whatever, watching the US provoke Russia into nuclear annihilation, which has been a real nightmare, ever since I was born, ever since the US dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan. And so it's very despicable that anybody would want to profit off of this killing, the potential annihilation of life on the planet. And it just shows to what lengths that these people will go to for their profit, and it almost seems like this horrible James Bond movie for world domination. It's scary to be adult in this time, seeing these things, just thinking, is there a future for my children and grandchildren. And it's really not a topic of conversation. The topic is support Ukraine, and if you don't support Ukraine, that means you must be a Trump supporter. It's just really crazy. It's just super crazy here. I think Don would verify that.
Well, let's talk about Americans then, since you're talking about it right now. Don Debar, I couldn't help but looking at one of the sound bites of an American in California at a particular gas station who was pumping her BMW SUV, saying that we got to stand with Ukraine because even though the gas prices are so high. So the reason why, I mean, that's one side of the story. The other side are the general public. The general public is watching. The last time around, we had, what, $700 million of military aid that the U.S., I guess, got approved. And I'm not too sure if you're a fan of Senator Rand Paul, but I'm going to quote him: "No matter how sympathetic the cause, my oath of office is to the national security of the U.S." And of course, saying that here we have, all this money going towards Ukraine when the Americans could use it. They could use it in many ways. So is that an aspect that the U.S. president looks at and says, it's okay, we got to go with Ukraine?
Well, the U.S. president looks at his teleprompter and he says whatever it tells him to say. I think that's widely known around the planet now. First of all, what Cindy said is absolutely true. This is like whatever else it is also a massive exercise in profiteering. Now, the $700 million that you just referenced is the most recent tranche, but it was a week and a half, 2 weeks ago, they approved almost unanimously in the two houses of Congress $40 billion to Ukraine, and that was the second tranche this year. There was 13.6 before that. The $40 billion is intended to cover a 5-month period to basically fund the war for 5 months. Now, annualized, $40 billion for 5 months is $100 billion for a year. And at $100 billion a year, you are almost 50% over the annual military budget of Russia. Only Russia's $65 million a year military budget provides for a military to fight a war in the Baltics if need be, in Ukraine if need be, in Poland if need be, in the Sea of Japan if need be, and in off the Korean Peninsula. In other words, the expanse of about 1/6 of the surface area of the planet. Russia defends itself with $65 billion. At just this crunch point in Ukraine, we're throwing in the equivalent of $100 billion. Does not include the UK, France, Germany, Italy, Poland, and the rest. That's the first part. The second part is if you look at how much money that actually is, okay, the total housing budget of the federal government, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, annually is about $45 billion. Now, we have millions of people in foreclosure, millions of people in eviction, hundreds of thousands to millions in the streets, and the condition is deteriorating, and yet we are giving enough to double our budget to Ukraine to cover 5 months worth of war with Russia at Russia's borders. It's insane.
It's interesting. Let me get your idea. Since you mentioned about how the money that's given so far by the U.S. Actually is almost the entire defense budget of Russia. So so if you put the two together, then they are spending that much. They should have made more advances. They, meaning the U.S. and its NATO countries, compared to Russia. We're going to talk about the narrative. But am I correct to look at it that way?
I think so.
Okay.
Well, I think that, first of all, if you take a look at what they actually get for that, first of all, if you're going to buy armaments, you need to have an army. I mean, the population of Ukraine is less than 1/3 of the population of Russia.
Right.
Half, or at least 1/3, their actual loyalty is to Russia. They're Russians. Also, the group that is in charge of Ukraine, the Nazis that are there, they're a distinct minority among the population. That's always how Nazis rule, by the way. They're brought to power by the rich, because that's whose interests they serve, and they get a group of people who are very desperate, excited, and make them crazy and intimidate the rest of the population. But you can't field an army with that.
Right.
unless you have the numbers, and they don't.
We have to talk about that. We have to talk about the foreign, I guess the foreign, I don't know what you want to call them. The Department of Homeland Security called them American white nationalists. My question to Cindy Sheehan. According to a report that was released by the DHS, U.S. fascists are fighting in Ukraine. American white nationalists with documented histories of violence are obtaining combat experience with advanced U.S.-made weapons. Now, the focus of this release was not so much about Ukraine, but the fact that the DHS is worried that these American fascist white nationalists, whatever you want to call them, are going to come back to the States and they're going to be radicalized. That was the gist I got from the article. But the fact that they're there, and the fact that you have, according to the DHS, that there are these white nationalists or fascists that include violent extremists that are actually being recruited at embassy in Washington, D.C. and consulates across the U.S. sheds another light. First of all, do you think that that's true? I mean, I'm assuming it is. The DHS came out. But, I mean, that really puts things into a different perspective when it comes to this particular segment who's in the war in Ukraine.
It's news to me, but I am having some echo. I have echo when I talk. Anyway, it's, I don't know if that's true, but they're going to fight with the Azov battalion, the Nazis in Ukraine. Is that what the thing is? Is that what their worry is?
It says, Cindy Sheehan, it says that the Department of Homeland Security, which has been gathering intelligence on Americans who have joined the ranks of more than 20,000 foreign volunteers. I'm assuming they are going to be fighting within or with the members of the Azov battalion, or the Azov movement, who are actively recruiting either ethnically motivated or violent extremists or these types of characters, which the U.S., with the participation of the U.S. It's hard to verify all of this. I can't argue against the DHS, you see, because it's not something that's covered so much by media outlets or by online news organizations.
Well, of course, we have to give anything anything that comes out of the U.S. government, we have to treat it with a grain of salt, and we have to try to verify it from independent sources. But, you know, we do know that many, you know, these people who wanted to go fight in a war, Americans went to Ukraine to sign up to fight against Russia. And we've seen from these same Americans who escaped from the Ukraine that they were put in these situations with guns that had very few bullets. They were essentially being used as human shields, and they had their passports taken away from them when they got there. So they had to sneak across the border into Poland, you know, using organizations like the American Red Cross to help them get over the border. So you know, if it is, I wouldn't be surprised at all if it is true, but it's certainly not like the communists and socialists who joined to go fight against fascism in Spain in the 1930s. You know, it certainly is a different cause, but we see, it's hard because we see here in the United States, we see people of all political stripes supporting the government in Kiev that has been sympathetic to Nazi elements. So we have widespread support for that here in the United States.
Don Debar, I got to get your opinion on this also. First of all, the whole Azov movement, if you want to call it that, the Azov battalion, and also the fact that the DHS has come out and saying that you have these white supremacists or white nationalists from the U.S. who are there fighting. What do you think?
Right. Well, yes, there are that. You know, spoken with Ava Bartlett and some others on the ground there, and in fact, that's true. Also, some have been captured, and you know, and some have come out. And what Cindy said is correct. That you know, they've been lose their passports, and they're trapped in there. Once they get a body in there, they said that we're cannon fodder. These are Americans. The DHS sentiment, or whatever they're expressing in this memorandum, certainly it's a valid point. If you look at Al Qaeda and 9/11, for example, the blowback thing. I'm not so sure that that this is, you know, an anti-policy of the government. In other words, I'm not so sure DHS is really concerned about it, and in fact, perhaps they're actually cultivating these, you know, these things. But I would like to point out, maybe 4 years ago, having conversations, you know, with folks here on Press TV and elsewhere, when shortly after Trump took office, in some schools, for example, somebody drew a swastika on a piece of toilet paper, or, you know, on a chalkboard said, you know, some slur or whatever that indicated that they were ultranationalist, right-wing Nazi types. And the whole country went bananas over this stuff. It was an indication that Trump was a Nazi, and anyone who uttered his name without vomiting was a Nazi or whatever. And we have Biden here. First, we have Obama and Biden and Clinton installing Nazis in control of Ukraine back in 2014, actively. I mean, even on the telephone with Vicki Nuland. And now we have Biden arming and training and, you know, ready to go to World War III with Nazis, on behalf of Nazis, hiring the Nazis in essence. And nobody's saying a word about it. In fact, if you point it out in social media, you get deplatformed for a while. You know, we are in bed to the extent that these people are really Nazis and not like crisis actors. Then we're in bed with Nazis completely, like, you know, with the covers over our heads. And that should be of concern to people here, whether they come back here or not, because it means the Nazis are already in control of the U.S. government here. We don't have to worry about some knuckleheads coming back with rifle skills and taking over the country. They're already in charge.
Uh-huh. Interesting. Well, we're quickly running out of time over here. I'm not too sure how to go about my last question, but Cindy Sheehan, what I'm looking at over here are the issue of sanctions against Russia. I mean, it is widely believed that it's not having the effect, the ultimate effect that the U.S. and its European allies wanted. I mean, the Europeans especially couldn't even have a unified stance when it comes to purchases of Russian oil and gas. I mean, oil they can maybe replace, but gas they can't. And they had to exempt some of the EU member countries from that. Well, that means that Russia is going to still continue generating revenue. So, and of course, we're looking at inflation, and we're looking at all the different consequences that's impacting all the countries across the world, really, but in particular the U.S. and the EU suffering from over 8% inflation. How much longer do you think that the U.S. and the European allies, NATO members in particular, are going to go after this war?
Well, what we need to understand here is the United States has had sanction regime for decades. They have embargoed Cuba. And so the U.S. uses sanctions to hurt, as you know, anybody in Iran knows, to hurt the people of the country. And what we're seeing here with the sanctions against Russia is that they're backfiring, and the chickens are essentially coming home to roost because the sanctions are causing more inflation and, hyperinflation and problems here in the United States.
Let me give 30 seconds to Don Debar. Don Debar, Ukraine wants missiles to reach Russia. U.S. says no. Why do you think that is? And do you think that the U.S. is just a step away from actually providing those missiles?
Well, in fact, the U.S. has provided them. They're just saying that they have governors, or they're not, don't have enough booster or whatever to reach Russia. All you have to do is drive a little closer to the border, and then suddenly it reaches. Russia has said, look, if you give somebody weapons and they use them against us, there's going to be a point in time when we're going to use our weapons against you, and we have some pretty powerful weapons that you're not going to want to see.
Thank you. Don Debar, journalist and activist from Westchester, New York. Cindy Sheehan, thank you so much. Anti-war activist from Sacramento. And with that, we come to an end for this edition of The Spotlight. From Mikawa Tagway and the team. It's goodbye.